When we ended 2 weeks ago, we were discussing Matthew's two statements, Jesus' one statement about the fulfillment of prophecy in verses 54 and 56, in which Matthew provides no specific reference to the scripture that's being fulfilled. And so we had decided the reason for that is that all scripture is fulfilled, and that Jesus, the passion of Jesus, the forthcoming passion of Jesus, represents a fulfillment of scripture as a whole rather than a fulfillment of individual passages. So nevertheless, there are some specific passages that the fathers particularly have pointed to as being fulfilled. So I thought we should look at those, sort of in the interest of completeness. So although there are very many, specifically in the patristic tradition, the fathers have tended to emphasize Isaiah chapter 53, Psalm 22, and Psalm 109. So let's look at those, starting with Isaiah chapter 53. It's the entire chapter. It's a chapter about the suffering servant.
The suffering servant, who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole. And with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. But oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. Oh, that was a question. That he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death. Although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth, yet it was the will of the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When he makes himself an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the fruit of the travail of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
So bearing the sin of many, and by his stripes we are healed. Despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And once the disciples abandoned Jesus, he's left alone. In Gethsemane, he's a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. And he's obviously about to be despised and esteemed not. Everybody's gone, and he's face to face with his accusers, who will then proceed to abuse him. So, the suffering servant who bears the sins of many. The second is Psalm 22, a psalm of David, which is generally interpreted as a messianic psalm. You can just read verses 1 through 24.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Who is the choir master according to the hind of the dawn, a psalm of David?
I'm not sure what the hind at the dawn means. The psalms are intended to be sung.
Oh, okay. That's
or
right.
sung or chanted. So there's, a choir or a choir master,
Okay.
or there can be. They can also, be chanted or sung individually. But so we saw that in which is it, the 118th Psalm, the one I never can remember its number.
Okay, that's all
So
right.
there's chanting to
I
the
only
priest.
remember it, Ron, because I've got it written down on my Bible.
Oh, that's a neat trick. I should try it for myself.
Not very good at that stuff either, remembering where.
Yeah. So there's the chanting, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and then bless, you are blessed from the house of the Lord, from the priest. So there's either song or chant in an exchange. So the Psalms are songs.
I know they're poetry, but I didn't know they were sung. Yeah. Okay.
My God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from my call for help, from my cries of anguish? My God, I call by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I have no relief. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the glory of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you rescued them. To you they cried out and they escaped. In you they trusted and we are not disappointed. But I am a worm, not a man, scorned by men, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They curl their lips and jeer. They shake their heads at me. He relied on the Lord. Let him deliver him. If he loves him, let him rescue him. For you drew me forth from the womb, made me safe at my mother's breasts. Upon you I was thrust from the womb. Since my mother bore me, you are my God. Do not stay far from me, for troubles is near, and there is no one to help. Many bulls surround me, fierce bulls of Bashan encircle me. They open their mouths against me, lions that rend and roar. Like water, my life drains away. All my bones are disjointed. My heart has become like wax. It melts away within me. As dry as a potsherd is my throat. My tongue cleaves to my palate. You lay me in the dust of dirt. Dogs surround me. A pack of evildoers closes in on me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among them. For my clothing they cast lots. But you, Lord, do not stay far off me. My strength, come quickly to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my life from the grip of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, my poor life from the horns of wild bulls. Do I continue?
Yeah,
Mhm.
just the next three verses through 24.
Okay. Then I will proclaim your name to my brethren. In the assembly, I will praise you. You will fear the Lord, give praise. All descendants of Jacob, give honor. Show reverence, all descendants of Israel. For he has not spurned or disdained the mystery of this poor wretch, did not turn away from me, but heard me and cried out, but heard me when I cried out.
Mm.
So notice the first line of the poem, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or why have you abandoned me? Which is what Jesus said as he was dying on the cross. So in the messianic interpretation of the psalm, death comes right after verse 21. So the servant of God dies,
Mm.
and yet he continues in verse 22 with praise to God, who is faithful, who has not despised the afflicted, who has not hidden his face from him, and who has heard his cries. So it's a powerful psalm of death, unjustified death, of being wrongly accused, of being persecuted, and of ultimate vindication. Then finally, Psalm 109. We'll just read verses 1 through 5, and then again 22 through 25. Oregon particularly emphasized this as one of the scriptures that was being fulfilled. Be not silent, O God of my praise, for wicked and deceitful mouths are opened against me, speaking against me with lying tongues. They beset me with words of hate and attack me without cause. In return for my love, they accuse me, even as I make prayer for them. So they reward me evil for good and hatred for my love. And verse 22. Actually, start with 21. But you, O God, my Lord, deal on my behalf for your name's sake, because your mercy is good. Deliver me. For I am poor and needy, and my heart is stricken within me. I am gone like a shadow at evening. I am shaken off like a locust. My knees are weak through fasting. My body has become gaunt. I am an object of scorn to my accusers. When they see me, they wag their heads. Help me, O Lord my God. Save me according to your merciful love. And we can stop there. So again, the unjustly accused servant. So those are some of the major scriptural prophecies and prophetic verses and psalms that were fulfilled. Although again, the real import of, I think, of what Matthew is saying is that all of Old Testament prophecy and all of the Old Testament law, the law and the prophets are fulfilled in the passion, the death of Christ. So Jesus is arrested, the disciples flee, and he's taken before Caiaphas, the high priest, along with the Sanhedrin. So there's an account of Jesus meeting with Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin in all three of the synoptic gospels, as well as in John. So let's read those. As we read, let's sort of try to be aware of the differences, and especially differences between Matthew and Mark, since there are sort of difference in emphasis between fundamentally the same story, but with very different nuances among the Gospels. So in Matthew, this is chapter 26, verses 57 through 68. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter followed him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests of the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last two came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?"
So Mark, what is
Chapter 14, verses 53 through 65. This follows right after Mark gets his clothes torn off and runs around naked through Gethsemane.
Jesus before the council? And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes were assembled. And Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, and their witness did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that it is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands. Yet not even so did their testimony agree. And the high priest stood up in their midst and asked Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But he was silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, Son of the Blessed? And Christ said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and come with the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tore his clothes and said, why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him and cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. And the guards received him with blows.
Notice there's some disparity between Mark and Matthew in the treatment of the false testimonies and in the report about the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. So the corresponding account in Luke is chapter 22, verses
And in Mark, he admitted that
right.
he was
In
Christ.
Mark, he said, I am. In Matthew, he's completely silent.
Yeah, I said you said so.
Right, he says, and you said so.
Peter's denial of Jesus. After arresting him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter was following at a distance. They lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat around it, and Peter sat down with them.
It actually starts at 63 because Luke has things out of order.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, 63 to 71.
All right. So the men who held Jesus in custody were ridiculing and beating him. They blindfolded him and questioned him, saying, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they reviled him in saying many other things against him. When Jesus came to the council of elders of the people, the council of the elders of the people met, both chief priests and scribes, and they brought him before their Sanhedrin. They said, if you are the Messiah, tell us. But he replied to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question you, you will not respond. But from this time on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. They all asked, are you the Son of God? He replied to them, you say that I am. Then they said, what further need have we for testimony? We have heard it from his own mouth. Luke's is not. It looks like his own. It doesn't really his account is a little out of sync with the other two. His narration.
Yeah.
A little more condensed. They didn't say anything about him blaspheming. They just said, so you heard it from his own mouth.
Yeah, there's no false testimony.
No testimony.
It's a very, very condensed. And Jesus' response If I tell you, you will not believe.
Believe.
If
Which
I
is-
ask you, you will not answer.
Which is good,
Is
because he knows.
is-
Yeah.
And then finally, John, it's in chapter 18, verses 12 through 14. And then again, then it's interrupted by Peter. And then again in verses 19 through 24. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews seized Jesus and bound him. First, they led him to Annas, where he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Incidentally, to interrupt, many have argued that who was the high priest that year indicates that John was unfamiliar with the priesthood or with Caiaphas, because Caiaphas was the high priest for very many years. And the high priest did not change office every year. The high priest was high priest from the time of becoming high priest until his death, except that in general, except that John is probably being ironic. Although Caiaphas was high priest for a relatively long time, the high priest was ultimately became selected by the Romans and by the governor. And often after Caiaphas, they in fact did change every year.
Hmm.
So there's an implication in John saying the high priest that year is that the high priest is a plaything, a puppet, essentially, of the Romans. So they're changed at whim, and Caiaphas happens to be the high priest that year. He may be for many years, but nevertheless,
That's his last year.
it's because he's serving at the pleasure of the Romans,
Wow.
and also because he himself is a political operator,
Wow.
which in fact, he survived as high priest for so long because he was a political operator. And he was, very adept at political manipulation and coming out looking good, even though, he himself wasn't good. So just an aside about the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had given counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. It's an ironic statement by Caiaphas, which we'll look at later. In fact, actually, why don't we look at it now? It's chapter 11, starting in verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, the raising of Lazarus is what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, notice we have the same phrase, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people and that the whole nation should not perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So from that day on, they took counsel about how to put him to death. So it's interesting that in chapter 18, John makes the ironic comment about the high priest that year. And then he goes on to the second irony. So,
19.
so Caiaphas says, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation. And Caiaphas says, you know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should not perish. So in fact, what happened is that because of Caiaphas and because of his plot and the plot of the others, the Romans in fact did come and destroy both the holy place and the nation. But that in that process, the whole nation of the people of God did not perish, but in fact was given new birth. So Caiaphas's words were prophetic, provided by the Holy Spirit. It was a genuine prophecy, but it was an unwitting prophecy. It was an ironic prophecy. For him, the prophecy, for him, it wasn't prophetic. It was a practical truth. And he had no idea that it was prophetic and that it was a prophecy against him.
Verse 19 to 24. John 8.
So then we have the interlude with Peter. And then we return to Jesus and Caiaphas in verse 19. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing secretly. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. When he had said this, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, if I have spoken wrongly, bear witness to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
Man,
And
somebody
then,
smacked you in the face. Somebody smacked you like that. You'd have to, most people would react to that. But he was very, very calm about how there were two options.
meek.
Yeah, very neat. Yeah.
And then that's the end of the whole thing. Then in verse 28, then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium, which is where Pilate is. In many ways, four very different accounts. And Jesus' defense, to the extent that he mounted one in John, is really kind of the same as his mention of why, didn't you arrest me in public in the temple as opposed to doing it in secret at night, since I've been in the temple preaching openly. So we sort of see slightly different interpretations of what happened in the Passion, or in the confrontation before the high priest. So the basic problem here stems from the fact that the Sanhedrin, so the Jesus is appearing before the Sanhedrin, and it's been debated about, sort of whether this is a formal trial or whether this is an informal trial. And it's argued that it can't possibly be a formal trial because it's Passover. And so the Sanhedrin is very unlikely to be gatherable because they're supposed to be celebrating Passover. But as we've suggested, this is actually the day before Passover. Jesus is only going to die on the Passover. But nevertheless, I mean, in some sense, that's a red herring. The basic problem stems, I mean, there is a question of whether this is a formal or an informal hearing, but the basic problem stems from the fact that the Sanhedrin has no authority to put anyone to death. So they don't have the ability to impose a death sentence on anyone. According to Josephus, the only exception is Gentiles who go into forbidden areas of the temple, and particularly go into the holy place, can be sentenced to death by the Sanhedrin. But aside from that, they don't have the ability to impose a death sentence. Also noticed here in Matthew's account, the Pharisees have dropped from view. This is the scribes and the chief priests.
Except for Peter, who follows from a distance.
Right. If we look at Deuteronomy, 2 witnesses are needed for a death sentence. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 6. We start at verse 2. If there is found among you within any of your towns which the Lord your God gives you, a man or woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God in transgressing his covenant, and has gone and served other gods and worshiped them, or the sun or the moon, or any of the host of heaven, which I have forbidden, and it is told you and you hear of it, then you shall inquire diligently, and if it is true and certain that such an abominable thing has been done in Israel, then you shall bring forth to your gates that man or woman who has done this evil thing, and you shall stone that man or woman to death with stones. On the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses that he is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. The hand of the witnesses shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from the midst of you. So the condemnation of death has to be at the hand of, and based on the evidence of at least two witnesses. So 2 witnesses are needed for a death sentence. Incidentally, there's a really, in reading the addition to Daniel in the Septuagint, it's Daniel chapter 13, verses 44 through 62. We won't read them, but if you want to read them, it's worth reading. It's the song of Susanna, where she's unjustly accused of adultery, and she's sentenced to death based on the testimony of 2 witnesses.
And that's Daniel what?
Chapter 13, verses 44 through 62. So she's sentenced to death based on the testimony of 2 witnesses, and then the testimony of those 2 witnesses is found to be false, so they're stoned to death.
Still.
They are. She's acquitted.
Oh, they are. Okay.
Yeah. So you need 2 witnesses. And Matthew says in verse 59 that they seek false testimony. Does anything sound familiar there? false testimony, false witness. Let's go back to chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. Starting at verse 16, this is the second part of the Decalogue. The first part of the Decalogue deals with the what we need to do in relationship to God, and the
Oh, right,
second
right,
part
right.
deals with
Okay.
what we need to do in relationship to our fellow humankind. So honor your father and your mother as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be prolonged and that it may go well with you in the land which the Lord your God gives you. You shall not kill, neither shall you commit adultery, neither shall you steal, neither shall you bear false witness against your neighbor,
Mm.
neither
Mm.
shall you covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his manservant, or his maidservant, his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. So neither shall you bear false witness against your neighbor.
Mhm.
So they're plotting not only to bear false witness, but to bear false witness in a capital case. So they've neatly encapsulated two violated. They're seeking to violate two of the commandments: "Thou shalt not bear false witness, and thou shalt not kill." So they're seeking to unjustly convict somebody and put him to death, which really amounts to murder. So it's a 2-for-1 deal. So from their point of view, the issue is that Jesus is guilty. So the challenge is that they have to prove it to the satisfaction of Pilate.
And he didn't see anything wrong with anything that Jesus had done.
Right.
But I'm jumping ahead. Sorry.
So the basic, so Matthew doesn't actually say what goes wrong, unlike Mark. Matthew says, now the chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, in verses 59 and 60, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward.
Hmm.
So Mark says that the problem is that the false witnesses did not agree.
Mark, yeah.
In Mark. So the basic thing here is that you want your you want to make sure that your false witnesses agree, because if they're questioned and there's a discrepancy in the story, the whole thing is going to go out the window and you're going to look bad. So you at least want a synchronized lie. So the thing is that here then, in Matthew's account, implicitly, he says, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward.
Mhm.
At last, two came forward and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. So the interesting thing here is that Matthew doesn't make it clear that that's a false testimony. The implication is that, in fact, it's a true testimony in Matthew.
Mhm.
And you notice what Matthew says, the accusation is, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. So then contrast that with what Mark says, which is very different. It's in chapter 14, verse 58. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.